Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Robin Mesnage, who holds a PhD in molecular and cell biology, is a toxicologist and research fellow at King's College London, where his work concentrates on the pharmacology and toxicology of glyphosate, otherwise known in the U.S. as Roundup, and other herbicides. We'll talk about glyphosate effects on the microbiome and cellular health, vulnerable periods of exposure to herbicides, where glyphosate or Roundup lurks, and ways to reduce exposure, and so much more. So stay tuned. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Robin Mesnage, who is a toxicologist and research fellow at King's College London, where his work concentrates on the pharmacology and toxicology of glyphosate and other herbicides, among lots of other things that he'll share with you today. He has over 100 peer-reviewed publications, 8,000 citations, and he covers everything from endocrine disruption to oxidative stress, gut microbiome, gut-brain health, and so much more. So thank you so much for making the time, Dr. Mesnage, for being here on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ali.
So you have done such remarkable work, and I actually stumbled across your work, believe it or not. I think it was on LinkedIn, and the new lead had done a story on this new article that just came out, this new research paper that really was talking about the carcinogenicity, if I say that correctly, the ability of glyphosate to contribute to the development of cancer. And it was a rat study. But what was so unique about this study, and we'll get into so much more about glyphosate, but since you've done so much work over the years, just tell me what was so interesting and new about this particular study that just came out in 2025.
Well, glyphosate has been on the market since decades and also controversial for decades about whether it's toxic, causing cancers or not. And there's many lawsuits about that. And it needed to have a new study to understand exactly what glyphosate does. And our study is unique because this is a study which was done on rats for their whole life. They were exposed to glyphosate and commercial formulations. And so we looked if tumors were developing like they would do in the human population, so starting prenatally until the rats get old, because believe it or not, but every carcinogenicity study which has been done on any chemical on the planet, it is done always only on adult animals. And so it always neglects sensitive periods. If a baby is exposed in utero during pregnancy to a pesticide, it can alter development and cause some problems which would lead later to tumors and cancer. And this is always underestimated by current toxicity tests. So we wanted to do better. And that's why our study has been exposing rats to glyphosate and commercial formulation lifelong and not just during the adulthood.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you're touching upon things that I've talked about and in my work as well, is that there's these vulnerable periods of development, of human development. And so when we're researching those, you have to get upstream. You have to get upstream, to in utero exposures to really see where that imprinting takes place potentially and how that plays out in the development of clinical disease. And tell us a little bit about, in this study, you used certain type of rats, Sprague-Dawley, I think it is. And am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
And basically that the value in terms of educating our audience is that you can control for other outside issues that you can't always control for in humans. Can you tell us a little about the setup?
Yeah, when you are doing these animal experiments, you have different groups, some which are exposed to the pesticides, some which just have plain water, and so they are control animals. And so in this case, we have an escalation of doses of glyphosate, an escalation of doses of commercial formulations of glyphosate. And so animals which are exposed to glyphosate during their whole life, they can be compared to the control animals which are in the exact same environment. The same type of cage, the same type of food, everything is the same except that they are not exposed to glyphosate. And so in this case, in these animal experiments, you can then conclude that glyphosate is the factor which has been causing the tumors, because this is the only thing which is different from the control.
And the 3 different doses that were used, I mean, are all 3 comparable to what humans, in terms of weight, milligrams per kilogram or exposure per weight, that a human being might be exposed to just from regular commercial food exposure that might be contaminated with glyphosate?
It's a bit over the doses that you can find in daily food, and we choose higher doses because we wanted also to do a study which is valid from a regulatory standpoint. And in this case, we took the values which are considered to be safe by regulators, and we tested if these values are actually safe in our setting. For that, we started from the acceptable daily intake. So this is the value which is set to protect consumers. The regulators claim that you can be exposed to this dose during your whole life, nothing will happen. Right. And then we took also some doses which are called the no effect level from some animal experiments. And so you escalate the doses until you have something where you know where glyphosate could have an effect. And in this case, with this range of dose, you can really conclude if, at least in this case, if the doses which are set by current regulatory assessments are safe or not. And in this case, because we have found some tumors at doses which are claimed to be no effect level, we can conclude at least that glyphosate is causing the cancer and that the current regulatory thresholds are not protective enough. It doesn't mean that someone who is buying bread contaminated by glyphosate is at risk of getting a cancer, but it means that the doses and the assessment which is done right now is not protective enough so that you put people at risk.
Interesting. And now you're in Europe, right? So you're really talking about regulatory agencies that are they stricter than the U.S. in terms of those ADIs and, in terms of the exposure or the intake, I should say dietary intake? Are they, how do they compare to the U.S. in terms of how we extrapolate?
It's a bit less strict in the US, so the regulatory assessment is more permissive, so the levels which are considered to be safe are higher, but not by much by comparison to the European assessment. And it's because in the end, the studies which are considered by regulators to establish glyphosate safety profile are the same in Europe and in the US. Their interpretation differs slightly, but it's not by a lot.
Okay, gotcha. So this was a pretty big study because you pulled in people from, it was Ramazzini, and it was how many different bodies were really involved. And you also had someone I admire greatly is Dr. Phil Landrigan, who's pretty well known in the US for his work. But this was a big study, and I think that's what brought more power to its results. And then you can tell us what you guys found.
Well, to make it brief, it was clear that glyphosate caused some cancers in these animals, a variety of different cancers, that these cancers also developed in young animals, so younger than what we typically expect, which was also something compelling to conclude that we were seeing something real. And we saw also that there was an escalation of the effect with the dose. So the more the glyphosate, the more we could see some cancers. And this is also something where it's conclusive in this case to conclude that glyphosate is responsible for this cancer. And this really brings confirmation of what we have been suspected for a long time.
And it's interesting you say, as a toxicology, the premise is always the dose makes the poison, right? So the more you're exposed to something, the more likely you're going to show those clinical effects, so to speak, or the endpoints are going to rear their head. So this was not a study that was specifically look at endocrine disruption or sort of lower levels that had sort of, unusual results that might not have been picked up on conventional testing. This was actually dose-related response, which too is scary. And, that's pretty remarkable. And it really made a lot of headlines, not all the headlines, but it certainly was out there. Tell us a little bit, if you don't mind. I mean, that's remarkable work, and I'm really, thank you for participating in that work. Tell us a little bit about glyphosate and herbicides to begin with. Where did this ever come from in terms of identifying it as a potential harmful to human health?
Well, glyphosate and pesticides are being used more and more because of our agricultural model. Like now we are cultivating plants and cereals in intensive manner in these big fields. They are prone to have weeds, parasites, and insects which are coming to eat the plants. So the farmers have to use more and more pesticides. And pesticides have been developed in the last decades, especially in this case, this is the herbicides like glyphosate. They are used to control weeds. Mm-hmm. And glyphosate has been used more and more in the last decades because it is really incredibly efficient. That is clear. And it is also cheap, easy to use. And so it became very handy. And in the end, farmers started to develop a dependency. They started to rely so much on glyphosate that it became unavoidable. And at the same time, there was a development of genetically modified crops, which have been mostly engineered so that they become tolerant to glyphosate and Roundup. So the farmers started to be using more and more of these plants, more and more glyphosate, and this is making a snowball effect because then the farmers don't know how to deal with their culture without this herbicide. They have to put more and more because the plants also become tolerant to glyphosate and resist. And in this case, this is leading to this situation where after decades of use, the glyphosate is now really by far the most used pesticide on the planet. And this is raising, in this case, a lot of question about the safety.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's almost like an addiction because it's like you said, it's safe, it's easy, it's been marketed well with top of the line marketing. The seeds are paired, right? The seeds that are sold actually are genetically modified, as you mentioned, to withstand this herbicide, so that everything around the plant dies, but not the actual plant or vegetable or produce that the farmer's trying to grow. And over time, it really has led to problems when they didn't expect so. They didn't expect that there'd be multiple sprayings. And it's also used as a desiccant, right? Towards the end of the growing cycle of produce, it's used to sort of dry it out, like one last go. Is that right?
Yeah, this is a use which is probably increasing a lot contamination of food. Right. That just before harvest, glyphosate is sprayed on the field and it makes the plant more dry because the plant is actually dying. And in this case, it makes it very easy to harvest. That is a use which was limited in the EU. And this is much better because it's clear that it is one of the source of glyphosate in the foodstuff. And it's clear that glyphosate is also used in other sectors. We are always thinking about farmers, but glyphosate is also used in railways, in parks, on golf courses, everywhere which there's amenities where weeds can grow. Glyphosate is also a major way of controlling these weeds.
And you said earlier, and I think this is important to discuss, is that a lot of times glyphosate, in fact, most times, is a mixture of chemicals where the active ingredient might say the glyphosate name. Like in many pesticides, even when they sprayed for mold in my house, there was like 0.001% of an active ingredient at the very top. And if you scan to the bottom where it says inactive, which we also called inert, so to speak, right? Tell us about those formulations and how even the labeling is so deceiving in terms of what's actually in these products and what the other stuff in there does, potentially.
Yes, when you are buying a bottle of pesticides, you always have one ingredient which is declared as active, and it's because it's active on a plant, but it doesn't mean that it will not be toxic also for you, and that others in the bottle will also not be toxic. And some of these, they are called formulants sometimes, or inerts. And so they are added to the formulations, but not always regulated, and they can participate to the toxicity of the formulation. So in the end, when you have a commercial formulation of pesticide, it's often more toxic than what is regulated, the active ingredient alone.
And can you go into sort of how glyphosate as the active ingredient works and the shikimate pathway? Can you share? I mean, some people have heard of that before, but can you tell us kind of where that active ingredient of glyphosate affects, enzyme pathways in animal studies and humans, if they exist?
Yes, glyphosate is acting as a herbicide because it's interfering with this pathway called the shikimate pathway, which is existing in plants, in bacteria, but not in animal cells. And it basically shuts down the production of some amino acids. And because these amino acids are very important for the plant will die if it doesn't have them. And so that's why glyphosate is a very efficient herbicide. And it was always considered to be safe because this shikimate pathway doesn't exist in humans and animals. And this is why it was always thought that it was toxic, but glyphosate can also act on other pathways, have other toxicity mechanisms, and this is what was ignored for a long time.
Yeah, and so just because it's only in plants, in their pathways, it doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't any outstanding issues with humans, which we're now considering strongly because of mammals, or I should say rat studies as well, are really good, kind of like the canary in the coal mine. But there's also findings you've had now that you've done so much more work in nutrition and you've done gut microbiome studies, and this is really a big area of your current work as well. What are the effects that glyphosate, if it's found in our food system, that it might have on our gut and our gut health?
So glyphosate targets the shikimate pathway in plants. This is what we were just talking about. And this shikimate pathway also exists in bacteria and other microorganisms. And that explains why glyphosate can also have effect on the gut microbiome. So all these bacteria that we have in our intestine are very important for our health. They can produce small molecules influencing our brain. They influence our brain and other organs very deeply. And so if glyphosate in this case interfere with these bacteria, it can have effect on the whole body, and this is what we showed in some animal studies. We looked at the gut microbiota of animals exposed to glyphosate, and we found that glyphosate was disturbing the gut microbiome of these animals, and this can create inflammation, this can create oxidative stress, and this is in this case adding oil on fire. When glyphosate is causing some problems in organs of animals, the fact that their microbiome is also affected really generate a cascade which makes animals sick in the end of their life.
So not only is there potential cellular damage in terms of the appropriate processes within cells to process properly, but there's also direct mechanical damage in a way to the gut microbiome, because the microbiome is just a very, very thin layer that's the interior of 26 feet of bowel, more or less.
Yeah, we have so many bacteria in our gut. If some are affected by glyphosate, maybe some pathogens will grow. And this is what we observed in some animals. Their bacteria, which are protective, the bacteria are here for helping us in this case, they were affected, and it could let some pathogens grow, And in this case, this was damaging for the health of animals. And so glyphosate acts at many levels, right, because we know that it will interfere in the cells of the animals with what we call the mitochondria. So these factories for energy inside the cells, they can be affected by glyphosate. And this is one of the mechanisms by which glyphosate will disturb the mitochondria, which then creates oxidative stress, and this oxidative stress can damage the DNA, and this damage to the DNA can lead to some tumors. This is really the chain of reactions that we know is well characterized for the effects of glyphosate in a laboratory animal, for instance. That's what we showed. And in this case, if you add damages to the microbiome, this is really amplifying the effects.
And you said pathogens, so you're saying that when you knock off the good guys, you basically are being left more unprotected for bad pathogens like salmonella and E. coli and anything else that you're eating in the food system that, oh, by the way, may not be overseen as well right now anymore because we have fewer people watching the food system. And so it's kind of this sort of, biology meets society issue, if you want to think about it moving forward, is that we're not going to have the protections for the bad guy bugs. And so the goal should be, and we'll get to those, is maybe in terms of recommendations, how to bolster your gut microbiome in a healthy way, which we'll get to. So other questions I had for you, how do we experience or get exposed to glyphosate on a day-to-day basis? You, me, people down the street. I'm in the US, you're in Europe. I'm just trying to give, what's an acceptable level of fear, and how do we understand what, where those exposures come from glyphosate and or even adjuvants that might go along with it?
So glyphosate exposure through the diet in the US is very common, and it's mostly coming from the use of glyphosate as a pre-harvest desiccant, so before the cereals are harvested. And in this case, glyphosate is used on wheat, on oat, all these cereals, and this is why the most common source of exposure in the diet will be breakfast cereals, will be bread, will be beer, every food item which is made out of cereals, especially the processed one, will be quite contaminated by glyphosate. In this case, it doesn't mean that you are at risk of developing disease, because we don't know fully whether these exposures to consumers are a problem. What is a problem, in my opinion, clearly identified, is that people are using glyphosate sometimes in their garden, sometimes there's glyphosate sprayed because they live near the fields. And in this case, these more concentrated exposures to glyphosate, they are a source of problems, because we know that this is corresponding to the levels where you are more at risk of having health problems. And so I think the environmental exposures to glyphosate, their effects are questionable. We still need more information to understand what happens, because we also don't know well how is the exposure of the US population to glyphosate. The big problem, in my opinion, this is really the applicators of glyphosate, whether it's farmers or people spraying in a city park, because they think that they are protected, they think that this pesticide is safe, but actually it is not as safe as it is indicated in their guidance.
And so you could argue that people are getting it from multiple ways into their body, which essentially, I argue is a sponge, because you're getting it not only from foods, from cereals that we enjoy, we've been raised on. I'm in the US, everyone loves their cereal in the morning, right? But it's the cereals, it's anything with wheat, and it's with other, soy, it's with other large crops, and also potentially the derivatives of soy, right? We don't always just eat soy, like tofu and soybeans. Yeah. There are derivatives of soy that are made into different products that get infused into processed foods.
Yes, and it's cumulative. And in this case, I'm not so worried about the adults who are already fully developed and have all their organ function fully mature, but the sensitive individuals like children or pregnant women, this is where we have to be more cautious, and we have to be more cautious by telling them to eat healthy, switch to organic food so that they are protected from these pesticides. There are a number of things which can be done so as to avoid exposure to pesticides and other toxic chemicals, and this is really, in my opinion, the pregnant women and young children which should be protected the most.
Yeah, in terms of a hierarchy of concern, we say that the vulnerable periods of human development, and we would also say, I mean, even though you're not into the world of menopause, but even hormones that change during teenage years and during menopause years, these are where the endocrine effects might have a play, but we still don't know entirely on that. But also another source of exposure maybe you can comment on is water and drinking water, because so much of the US water system, not that you're totally well versed on that, but you can imagine when you're having city water that services 85, in our country, 85% of the US population is from municipal tap water, and water that is used, that goes through those wastewater treatment plants comes from lakes and streams and runoff from rainwater and aquifers under the ground. Is that a source of exposure for glyphosate and other herbicides that make their way into the water system?
It is a source of exposure, but I would not say it is the most important, because the concentrations in water are generally lower than what can be found in cereals or cereal products, which is heavy concentration, which is heavily concentrated in glyphosate. And in this case, I would not fear about the water so much for glyphosate. The water can be a source of many other chemicals, but the risk for glyphosate, this is mostly the consumption of food products, mostly ultra-processed food, based on different cereals which are sprayed by glyphosate.
Interesting. And how about in terms of air exposure? I know it's probably much less than, again, by ingestion, but would you say people that are running around and living quite comfortably and quite regularly in parks that are sprayed quite regularly, would you say that that's something to be concerned enough about to not go? Or, I mean, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here in terms of how much cumulative dose by the lifestyles that we lead and the exposures we can't always control, how much should we be concerned about if you had your say in it?
Yes, in the exposure, which is if you are living near fields or a park which is sprayed, this is exposure to spray dilutions, which are very concentrated in glyphosate. And these are probably the most dangerous, because you are exposed to glyphosate concentrations, in this case, which are at doses likely to have a toxic effect. And this is much more dangerous than what you find in the foodstuff, which is probably 1 million times less concentrated than what you find in the air. So that's why really living near a park, it can be a bit everywhere, golf course, cemeteries, railways. If you are near a place where glyphosate is sprayed and you know that it is sprayed, it is better to be protective in this case, and maybe you close the windows of your house when it's generally the morning time. This is when glyphosate is generally sprayed, and sometimes you can even smell it, and that there are some pesticide which is being sprayed, and in this case better be protected and not go too much outside.
Yeah, I mean, I live in New Jersey. New Jersey is the garden state. I write about this in several of the books that I put out there, but even when I post that I live in the corner of 200 acres of glyphosate farmed land. And for the last 22 years, I have tried to negotiate with these farmers and brought over organic beers to have a drink with them and try to really connect with them. And actually, it's worked for certain portions, but, in terms of changing out. But, it's been a real challenge. And again, when you're living near farmland, there's a lot of places in the U.S. that are, sprayed. Certainly the farm belt in the middle of the U.S., we know in Iowa and Corn Belt, that area. It's a really tough situation. And just to make note is that I've also looked up in New Jersey that you have to ask the farmers to let you know when they're going to be spraying. That actually is a legal notice that you have the right to know when they're going to be sprayed, so that you can either leave for the day, leave for the week. I could leave my animals, take them from outside, my dog and my cat. So there are things we can do even if we can't pick up and move. And I think that's an important thing to share also. And they do spray in the morning, because I've seen them spray in the morning. They scuttle in and they scuttle right out. So it's very unnerving. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. Tell me a little about, in terms of glyphosate and sort of a lot of the news has really talked about these big cases, 52 million for one, a gentleman who worked for a school, and he was the groundskeeper, and he was spraying, and then he ended up having non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's many other cases. There's actually hundreds, if not maybe more, if I'm correct. But that one got a lot of attention, and then I think it went back for appeal. So, are we at this point where we're really kind of building such a number of cases that, in fact, Monsanto, which again bought glyphosate and Roundup from Bayer, do you think that they're going to go
the other way around?
Oh, the other way around. I'm so sorry. So are we building to a point here where they might go bankrupt from all of these continued lawsuits? Where do we stand in the US? If you know about it, where do we stand?
Well, I've lost track, because these lawsuits, there are so many, and it goes back and forth in appeals, because this is thousands of people who have been suing Bayer because they developed a cancer and questioned whether glyphosate or Roundup was contributing. And in this case, there's a lot of evidence showing that glyphosate is carcinogenic, and Monsanto, Bayer claims that it is not. And so it's really complicated cases, and all these litigations have had different outcomes, but it's clear that this is not good for the health of the company, that their product is so controversial, and I would not be surprised if they have been losing billions of dollars in these lawsuits. I've lost track in what stage it is, but it is clear that this is really a big public scandal, and whether all these farmers have actually developed cancer because of glyphosate or maybe something else, it's really a very complicated case, because every individual has its history, and in the end it's generally a battle of different experts going to the court, explaining their theories, and it ends up by being the decision of a jury, whether this side or the other is convincing. And that is really making a complicated story, because that's where science is not only black and white. You have different levels of confidence, and whether this is reasonable or not, this is also then up to a jury to also make their conclusion. So it is a very complicated case.
Yes. And in terms of the arguments that have been formulated around glyphosate saving the world's need for food, and what do you say to that? Because that has been one of the biggest arguments about pushing glyphosate, pushing pesticides in general, is that it's really helping to feed a growing world population, that people are going to be starving if they don't have pesticide. The production goes up. In fact, isn't that completely the opposite on some levels in terms of the food production that feeds the world, and then exposure to extra layers of glyphosate? What do you say about that?
So it's from the 70s, glyphosate and many pesticides have been starting to be used more and more to grow food intensively, and this was filling some needs. It was useful. It was making more food to feed the world. Why not? But then the situation is changing, and farmers don't have other alternatives, but they are pushed to only use this system of glyphosate, other pesticides, where the plants become resistant, and farmers are becoming dependent on using more and more glyphosate. It becomes more and more expensive for them. And in this case, after some decades, it's the opposite. It's the overuse of pesticide is becoming a problem, not just for the health, but also to have sustainable food production, because we depend on this pesticide. We have lost the ability of doing more traditional agriculture or according to agroecology or other principles. And this type of agriculture, when you have very vast lands which are used to produce food intensively using pesticides, the soil becomes poor, the diversity of the environment becomes poor, and you can then only keep having this snowball effect towards something which is unsustainable, and it's very difficult to change the agricultural model. In the future, it's clear we need to change this agricultural model, because it is not sustainable to do what we do using so many pesticides to just cultivate one crop over vast lands, because the soils are becoming poor. And many of these soils, they are already abundant. Some people have stopped cultivating on them because you kill the soil, right, and you kill the ability of growing food. And so in the end, this is becoming more and more of a problem, and we need to change urgently in the next decades the way we cultivate. And for that, we need more research, more promotion of alternatives to go out of this system. We are in this loop, which is just like because this is the way the market is working for demand and production pushes towards this intensive food production, like if there is no alternative, and in the end this is really a dead end.
Yeah, and soil quality, I wish, I'm going to hopefully try to find someone who can really speak to the soil quality as well as you, but it really, the predictions in terms of nutritional value of the soil that goes into our produce, in terms of what we actually gain from eating nutritious food or not nutritious food, is really going to have its own cycle of health effects potentially, because we're not getting nutrition, which offsets a lot of what goes on even from an environmental perspective. So tell me, in USDA farming, now you have the equivalent of organic farming. What do you call that over in Europe in terms of your certification? Is it considered organic as well?
Yes, we have a certificate. We have different types of organic certification, but we have one which is really mainstream and equivalent to what the USDA is doing.
And when we get crops in the U.S., just to clarify to people who are listening, that when we get organic crops USDA certified, which happens to be the only real food regulation in the U.S. that keeps thousands of pesticides and farming chemicals out of our food system for those products, even processed packaged foods, that means that it has to be without colors and dyes and genetically modified ingredients. But when we get products from other countries, like I had blueberries from Peru that said USDA organic and anything, it has to follow along the same certification criteria. Is that correct?
Yes, it is the same in the EU as well, whether the organic food is produced in the EU or in other countries, it has to follow the same rules. Whether this is the case or not, this is another question, because when you are producing in some of these low-income countries, there's more fraud. Clearly, this was already established. And so whether the organic food you buy from Peru is of same quality as what you buy in the US, there is a lot of question marks on that. And it's also the impact on the environment in the end. Sometimes you make a choice of having organic food because this is more sustainable for the environment, better for human health. But if it's also cultivated on the other side of the planet, sometimes it's also not sure if it's making the ethical choice.
So there's no real way to know, actually, if my blueberries from Peru were officially organic. Are you saying, or is it something that you can't always know anything about, in terms of it's questionable at times. You really don't have.
It should be organic. It should follow the same principle. But when you look at facts, there are more fraud in these countries.
Yeah, and I understand that, there's no perfection here. It's just the best that we have within the system, and there's no way to look that up in each. So yeah, you have to work with what you got. You can grow your own, which would certainly be something more reliable. You can go to your farmers markets locally, at least here in the US. It's wonderful, and you can get to know your farmers. But really anything that comes from overseas, anything that's bought in a store, anything that's brought up by Amazon, anything you can think of, it's really, you don't know for sure, 100%. So I wanted to, take the time now to really focus on solutions, because I know you're full of solutions. I'm sure you have your own opinion that's infused into those recommendations, given all of the work and research you have done. So can you tell this audience, what would be your top 5 or 10 or whatever you want to share with us in terms of what you do or what you would recommend, knowing what you know, in terms of reducing glyphosate exposure?
Well, to reduce glyphosate exposure, I think one of the good tips is probably first to buy organic, then to cook by yourself, because when you cook by yourself, you tend to avoid some of these ultra-processed food buying from supermarkets, which are full of glyphosate. And if you are living in an area where glyphosate is sprayed, also to be careful with like closing your windows. Another good tip is to ventilate the house and clean the house, because in the dust there's a lot of endocrine disruptors and pesticides which can accumulate. And so exposure to dust is really also a frequent contributor to being exposed to many toxic substances.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a great one, because it's not just glyphosate. Like I said, try not to pick out too many single things, but try to think globally about exposures. I was going to add a few to that because, clearly I'm exposed to all this information. I'm a big fan of water filtration, just because at least in the US, we know that even though I'm glad to hear you're saying that exposure to glyphosate is probably lower on the list than through ingestion, and the foods we eat with cereals and that kind of thing that are not organic. But I would say that, even filtering water that's from a well, and soil is incredibly absorptive, right? So we know that wells in the ground can absorb chemicals from miles and miles away. And so whether you're in a farming state like myself or anywhere where there's parks and, so you're pretty much prone to a lot of exposures.
It is better to filter in this case, that's for sure.
Do you have a preference that you tell people in terms of, I say any filtration is better than none. I never poo-poo anyone's choices to filter, whether it's carbon block. But would you say even amongst those choices that maybe reverse osmosis, I'm sure in the EU you have plenty of those options. Is that something you might recommend, given that the price points are so much lower now?
Yes, it's probably better than to have these, sometimes these filters which are not single use but can be replaceable. It's also a lot of plastics, and they can be also contaminated by other things because they are overused. And so reverse osmosis is a solution, but it's clear that in this case, filtration is better than nothing. And so I would not just put a clear indication on what to use. It's just sometimes we have to do also, we have to make these efforts accessible so that everyone can also benefit.
Oh, for sure. And definitely even the cost of drop-in replacements can be more expensive than certain systems that you put in. So you have to think it through and see what works for you and your family. In terms of, we do a lot of lawn and garden in this country. It's like a lot of people, it's I think the number one hobby in the US. Would you recommend to really think about other sustainable ways to garden and not using herbicide or herbicide products that include glyphosate?
Yeah, it's not something Roundup. That I think always first, because in the EU, we are quite protected from this in the regulation for use of pesticide in the garden. But I know that it's true that in the US, the regulation is really not as protective, and people will tend to overuse pesticides. And because they don't know how to use them with really properly and with protection, it's very frequent that people intoxicate themselves or intoxicate their animals, like intoxications of cats or dogs with pesticides sprayed in the garden. This is really classic, and this should be avoided. And so it's clear that learning how to garden without pesticide is a must, and sometimes it's how to change the way we appreciate a garden. Sometimes it doesn't have to be just a very clean grass layer, but having some flowers, some pollinators, more diversity. This is much better. And I think it's about standards also of what we like in this case, but also something that I want to mention, and it's not specific to glyphosate, but we tend to overuse pesticides also inside our homes to kill mosquitoes or lices or like pests in general, and this is also a big contributor. The collars from dogs, which are meant to
dog collars,
to avoid them having ticks or other parasites, they are full of pesticides and at doses which are very dangerous. And so in this case, sometimes some people have been telling me that they have some issues and they are careful, they buy organic food and so on, but they are not aware of what they do in their home, and they are intoxicated by pesticides because they use insecticides in their home. They don't know that in their dog collars there's grams of pesticides which can be really dangerous.
Yeah, this is such a great point that you just made, because I think we only think about farms and glyphosate and cereals and those kind of headliners. But when we talk about our own home as a sanctuary, we really do bring in, and I speak for myself, there's always a wasp spray that you spray because you're afraid of wasps and no one's protecting themselves with a mask or whatever. You're spraying it indoors, outdoors. But children playing with dogs and cats that have these collars. I mean, I remember 15 years ago, I was spraying the ointment between the scapula, in the back of the shoulders of my dog. No gloves, didn't wash. Kids were all over the dog, The other thing is tracking in pesticides from lawn care and considering a bucket to put all the shoes in once before you get into the house, if you can do that. But remembering that your kids play on that lawn, your pets get walked on those lawns, and then they're really just tracking that into the home. So that's another really important place to avoid bringing it into your home sanctuary kind of thing. In terms of other places, I kind of research, children's snacks, thinking about, are there really glyphosate residue-free brands? I mean, where they're now getting into just specific glyphosate, or is it just better to choose non-processed foods or ultra-processed snacks? Thinking about not buying genetically modified, GMO-free labeling. Organic will really take care of that as well in terms of labeling. But it just seems like there can be big business in labeling, and it's sometimes overwhelming, I think, for parents.
Yes. There is a big business in labeling, and this is also mixed with the business of advertising. And in this case, it is better to follow simple rules of avoiding ultra-processed foods, snacks like that, and sticking to some fruits or some nuts, something which is less prepared and processed. And this, of course, if it's organic, it's always much better.
And in terms of washing, I don't want to, belabor this too much, but I really think this is usable information for the audience. But when we talk about, even I write about, if you can't buy organic, it's not accessible. You you don't have access to it. If you buy conventional produce, and you wash the produce or agitate it in baking soda and water or white vinegar and water, is it okay, or should we be peeling off? I mean, there's some mention as to whether or not the peel is really what you should be taking off, and yet that tends to have a lot of nutritional value. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you use vinegar or baking soda, you would remove some pesticide, that for sure. A fraction, not a lot. It's better than nothing.
Right.
Peeling, it's better to eat organic and also eat the skin because it contains a lot of fiber. And this is healthy.
Yeah.
If you can't do that, it's true that if you are buying some products which are likely to be contaminated by a lot of pesticides, like fruits, like apples, it's better to peel them in this case. So it's always depending, but I would also in this case avoid to buy the products which are very likely to be contaminated by pesticides. If you are buying berries, for instance, berries can be full of pesticides. In this case, it's not just glyphosate, it's also insecticides and fungicides. And if you can't buy organic ones, better not buy them, because in this case, they are really heavily contaminated by pesticides. There are products like that. There are other products where they are not likely to be contaminated by pesticide and less. And so we have to make the choices like that. So, and this is difficult to educate also, like families to buy the right ones and find what are the most contaminated. There are these lists sometimes, the dirty dozens.
Yeah.
This is useful, but basically this is really like in the end, when you are having these fruits which are a bit soft and perishable, this is the ones which are very easily contaminated by pesticides because they are fragile and they will be eaten by insects. Also, when you get leafy vegetables, because they can be also contaminated by a lot of pesticides, this one, if it's not organic, to be avoided. But if you have some things which are more growing into the ground, which are more robust, like cauliflower, they are less likely to be contaminated by pesticides. Or not, it's not that they will not be contaminated, but it's less. And so we have to make this the choice this way and do the best we can, because we can't be the best version of ourselves. We also have to deal with the reality of life.
I love that. And that's kind of the messaging, I like to share as well. This is not about perfection. What you just said is that things that grow underneath the ground are probably a little less risky than maybe things that are out in the surface being sprayed above, that leafy green vegetables and things with skin that you would eat, produce like peaches and berries and nectarines and cherries, all those things. Perhaps those might have higher levels of pesticides, and maybe choose things that are watermelon, cantaloupe, things that might have a skin. I mean, would you agree? And that you're eating the interior of that produce. So there's the little things you can do. And then there's the Dirty Dozen Clean 15 list, which, comes from Ken Cook and the Environmental Working Group, which I think is it's great. It's a guide. It's using USDA data that's done every year, where they test the residue levels on conventional produce, not organic, to see which produce has the highest level of residue and which ones have the lowest, which would be the Clean 15. So Dirty Dozen Clean 15. And it's available for free online. So please look that up if you're interested. And we can put the link in as well. This has been so extraordinarily helpful. Really just, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your work, because this is such an area of contention and people are very, very picky and concerned, of course, about food and health related to food. So, are there any things that you want to add to, you're doing so much work, not just in pesticides, but in the gut microbiome area, which is so critical. So just anything you would love to add to share with this audience, because I know they would eat it up, no pun intended.
Yes, few things. Probably looking beyond glyphosate, it's also looking at having healthy food so that you can build resilience by having healthy habits, because it's not just about intoxication, it's also about detoxification. You can build the detox of your body to be more active and your body to be stronger. So having a healthy lifestyle is how you can also protect yourself from these chemicals, because then you are exposed, but you are more resilient. It will not have an effect on you. And something very important is really to protect the sensitive individuals. And if someone is pregnant around you, like trying to educate and pass the right message and to make the right choice, because it's really during these moments that you can have effects which are lifelong then for the babies. And I don't want to be too scary about that, but this is really a moment to be careful to read about what can be done to protect your health and asking some professional, because when you are pregnant, you're educated about avoiding some food because it can contain some bacteria and making you sick, but you are rarely educated about avoiding some chemicals product which can also make you sick and your baby also sick. So I think this is really what I want to insist on, is really the vulnerability of some people more than others.
Really well said and agreed. If we can move this more even into the Western medicine area and have this more as a priority in terms of not just eating less raw seafood and thinking about things that are, less so-called conventional at this point. But I will say this has been just a really eye-opening, wonderful, hour. And thank you so much for sharing all of your, you have so much other, people want to read more about your work and your research. We're going to link a couple articles, including the one we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. Yeah. So Dr. Robin Mesnage, thank you so much for taking the time for sharing to our audience and giving us great information and useful tips. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Take care.